the collapse of the Penn Square Bank, its relevance to the 2008 financial crisis, and the lessons that should have been learned but largely were not. The collapse of Penn Square Bank in 1982 was one of the first major banking failures in the modern era that revealed just how interconnected and fragile the American financial system had become. A small Oklahoma City-based bank, Penn Square punched far above its weight by issuing high-risk energy loans and selling those loan participations to much larger institutions. The failure of this single bank triggered a domino effect that contributed to the near collapse of Continental Illinois, one of the largest banks in the United States at the time, which had to be bailed out by the federal government. Philip L. Zweig's Belly Up, The Collapse of the Penn Square Bank, meticulously details the rise and fall of this reckless institution, exposing a pattern of unrestrained risk-taking, inadequate regulatory oversight, and a financial system designed to reward short-term profit at the expense of long-term stability. The book is a case study in how financial bubbles form and burst, and it should have served as a warning for future crises. Yet nearly 3 decades later, the 2008 financial collapse followed an eerily similar trajectory, exposing the systemic failures that had not been addressed in the wake of Penn Square. Penn Square's business model revolved around issuing aggressive, often speculative loans to the oil and gas industry during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a time of high energy prices and widespread enthusiasm for fossil fuel investments. These loans were then bundled and sold to larger institutions, which were eager to profit from what seemed like a booming sector. The bank's underwriting standards were notoriously loose, with deals often made based on relationships rather than sound financial analysis. As oil prices collapsed, many of these loans became worthless, revealing the shaky foundation upon which Penn Square's success had been built. When the bank failed, it didn't just take itself down, it took with it the stability of larger banks that had depended on its deals, culminating in the federal government stepping in to rescue Continental Illinois in what was, at the time, the largest bank bailout in U.S. history. The same cycle played out in 2008, though on a much grander scale. Instead of energy loans, subprime mortgages became the toxic financial product of choice. Banks, mortgage lenders, and financial institutions across the country aggressively issued home loans to borrowers who in many cases had little ability to repay them. Just as Penn Square sold its loans to bigger banks, subprime mortgages were packaged into securities and sold to investors, who in turn relied on ratings agencies that vastly underestimated the risks involved. The bursting of the housing bubble led to cascading failures, eventually necessitating massive government bailouts to prevent a full-scale financial meltdown. Despite the nearly 30-year gap between the two crises, the same systemic failures were evident in both. A culture of excessive risk-taking, fueled by the pursuit of short-term gains, created an environment in which financial institutions had every incentive to act recklessly. Regulators, whether through negligence, ideological commitment to deregulation, or outright capture by the industries they were supposed to oversee, failed to step in before disaster struck. In both cases, the response was reactive rather than preventive, with bailouts ensuring that the worst offenders avoided true accountability. The story of Penn Square should have been a lesson in the dangers of an unregulated financial system, where small players can introduce systemic risks that eventually engulf the entire economy. The 2008 crisis should have been an even stronger lesson, yet much of what allowed that collapse to happen remains in place today. While regulations such as the Dodd-Frank Act were introduced in response, many of its provisions have since been weakened or rolled back under pressure from the financial industry. The core problem, an economic structure that incentivizes short-term profits while socializing losses, has not been meaningfully addressed. Reading Belly Up today, one can't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The names and the industries change, but the fundamental nature of financial capitalism remains the same. The Penn Square debacle was a preview of what was to come in 2008, and the 2008 crisis itself may well be a preview of the next financial collapse. Unless the underlying incentives that drive financial decision-making are restructured, history will repeat itself again, this time perhaps on an even greater scale.